On the eve of the French Revolution, the population of France was around 27 million people, most of them rural and tied to the land. These people were divided into the three estates, a division stemming from medieval Europe, and whose groundwork was established all the way back since the days of the Roman Emperor Diocletian. And from that moment onwards, society changed and shifted into the traditional division we're all familiar with: the clergy, the nobility, and the peasantry. Each of these three made the three estates. We'll start from the bottom and work our way up, and as such, we'll begin with the third estate, which composed around 95% of the population. The overwhelming majority of the third estate were peasants. They themselves were around 80% of the country's population. At the very bottom of the pyramid were the landless peasants, who were often forced to become migrant workers or day laborers just to stay alive. And as inflation increased, these very same laborers were not receiving the wage increases that could accommodate for it, and in turn, not affording the most basic necessities of life. Some of them would turn to begging, theft, or banditry according to the circumstances. Above the landless peasants were the peasants which owned or leased a little land. These lands, however, were tiny plots which could barely sustain a family, much less produce a surplus for the market. 18th century France was noted to have very backward and inefficient agriculture. These peasants' ambition was to rise to the final third of the peasant subgroup, and that is the independent farmers. These peasants not only had enough land to sustain themselves, but could also provide jobs to rural workers and loan some of their own farming equipment to their poorer neighbors. Because of the economic advantage they had over their neighbors, these farmers were often loathed and envied, as they posed a serious threat to the other landed peasants should these ever fall behind on a loan, even though their aspirations was to end up becoming one of these. With this, we have left the majority of the population behind, and as such, we can move into the rest of the country. We're moving away from the rural areas and into the urban areas. Well, kind of. Most so-called urban areas had less than 2,000 people living in it, and only 8 cities even surpassed a population of 50,000, among them Lyon, Marseille, Rouen, Bordeaux, and of course, the capital itself, Paris, which had a population of over 650,000. Inside the city we find the very bottom of those that weren't peasants, those being the landless peasants who migrated into the urban areas to find a labor. The best these poor, unskilled workers could get was a position as a servant in the better-off families, but for the most part, they relied on day labor and temporary work projects. Above the unskilled workers were, expectedly, the skilled workers. Their organization ended up being a reason for the French Revolution, as the restrictive guild system was still in full effect. Apprentices were, in effect, indentured servants forced to serve a specified time, usually a few years, before they were allowed to become journeymen, where they would ply their trade and feud, often getting into literal physical fights with local competitors they would come across. After whatever arbitrary time was set up, they were allowed to become masters, buying their way into the club and setting up their own permanent shops, where they would take on apprentices, restarting the whole cycle again. It would be from these urban workers that the famous sans-culotte would emerge from as the revolution exploded, as sans-culotte is named to those who did not wear the silk knee breeches favored by the upper classes. Above the skilled workers was the secured urban elite, those who did favor the silk knee breeches, and they were considered to be a distinction we're all familiar with, the bourgeoisie. However, this term did not merely apply to those who owned the means of production, merchants, industrialists, or bankers. This term included the middle-class professionals, such as lawyers, doctors, and men of letters. They were one of the fastest-growing groups in 18th century France and now had a large portion of the nation's wealth. It should be noted, though, as this group became wealthier, among those more ambitious, they did not, in fact, funnel its wealth back into the trade that enriched them in the first place. And the reason for this is because they were still living under the Ancien Regime. Their aim was, instead, buying their way into the nobility. For much of history, the hallmark of wealth and status was not in fact money, but land. So the most ambitious of the bourgeoisie focused on buying just that. The other investment opportunity was the Vino Office, a machination invented by Louis XIV, where a government office would be purchased rather than appointed. These were massively expanded during the reign of Louis XV as a way to increase revenue for the state without having to levy new taxes, which the nobility would, no doubt, resist. The Vino offices were so coveted because many of them came with a promise of ennoblement. Most had to be held for a few generations in order for the title holder to become a noble, but some Vino offices brought ennoblement immediately. Furthermore, these offices carried tax exemptions of all sorts. Over the years, these offices became a form of property, so to speak, and as the bourgeoisie grew, so did the price of Vino offices. At the very top of the Third Estate were those who were so well off they no longer even worked as a profession, relying on lift-off rents and other investments as their way of making money. The very small group of these people constantly stayed small because when one had acquired such wealth, they generally were in the process of buying their way into the nobility. In other words, the Second Estate. And with this, we finally move from the Third Estate to the Second Estate. By this point, the Second Estate had a population somewhere between 100,000 and 400,000 people. It's difficult to tell due to records being unreliable. Having no more than 2% of the country's population, this group outright owned anywhere from a quarter to a third of all the land in France, not to mention held feudal rights over the rest, including the right to collect taxes or to force tenants to use their material at whatever arbitrary price they set. The Second Estate also owned a controlling interest in many of the non-trading commercial pursuits, including mining and metallurgy, and, though less openly, owned a controlling interest in most of the trading industry, using Third Estate surrogates to skirt around prohibitions on the nobles engaging in trade. It should be noted, however, the nobility was not a unified class, and, in fact, divided itself into two distinct groups, the sword nobility and the robe nobility. The sword nobility was the real, true blue nobility, the descendants of those who fought alongside the French kings, who could trace back their lineage hundreds of years, looked down upon the new nobility that just recently gained its status, and, by recent, anything less than 4 generations ago. As much as they looked down at the robe nobility, however, the sword nobility had much of their fortunes at this point eroded to almost nothing, and thus the robe nobility held the majority of the wealth of the Second Estate. The robe nobility were these new nobles. Former members of the Third Estate, they had accrued enough wealth to buy their way into the nobility, and due to the creation of venal offices, it had expanded massively. However, there was one group in the Second Estate above both the sword and the robe nobility, and that is the old nobility that had actually managed to maintain its generational wealth. These were the people still able to afford living with the king in Versailles, and dominated all the major positions in the royal ministry, the army, the judiciary, and the church. This group, as expected, tended to be naturally conservative, but from this group there are key members of the liberal nobility that would be so important in the initial stages of the revolution, most notable of all, the Marquis de Lafayette. Then we have the First Estate, aka the Church. I don't really want to say above the Second Estate because the First Estate really was its own separate institution, which ironically tended to mirror the kingdom at large. Composed of around 130,000 people, this group held about 10% of the land. In 1546, the Pope had conceded to the King of France the right to appoint all the bishops and abbots of the French Church. And much like the kingdom at large, all the top jobs and privileges fell to the younger sons of the French nobility, carrying with them massive salaries, the right to collect tithes, and control over all church-held lands, while the majority of the clergy were priests recruited from the Third Estate. And these priests had absolutely no say in how church wealth was distributed. This gave way to a massive gulf between the noble ecclesiastic authorities and the common priesthood. And at the very top of the pyramid was the king himself, Louis XVI. A king of the Bourbon dynasty, Louis XVI is generally agreed to just not have been prepared for the role as king, especially for the very turbulent period he ended up ruling over. He was a bright and athletic man, but also shy and uncomfortable to be in the spotlight. Unfortunately for him, the Ancien Regime, as set up by Louis XIV, required the king to be very much in the spotlight. Worse still, he had married Marie Antoinette, who also knew both of them were still too young to rule properly. Not to mention, she was an Austrian princess. And the reason why Marie Antoinette being an Austrian is bad is due to public perception, as when we're talking about Austria, what we're really talking about is the House of Habsburg. And the Habsburg had been the biggest rival of France on the continent for the last 300 years, a continuous conflict that had been set up with the death of Charles the Bold of Burgundy in 1477. Because of this, the public at large saw Marie Antoinette with distrust, if not outright hatred. The trigger for all of this to change would be the discovery that France was in dire need of financial reform.